Welcome to 11 Recaps. If you enjoy this summary, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. It really helps me keep bringing you engaging content. Ready for your support? Awesome, thank you. Let's dive in. The lake stretched out before the manor, a sheet of ice glinting under the pale winter sun, its surface deceptively still until it wasn't. Elizabeth stood on the shore, her breath fogging in the biting air, her eyes locked on Louisa, a small, defiant figure stomping across the frozen expanse. The girl's steps were bold, her 7-year-old frame carrying the weight of a stubbornness Elizabeth recognized too well. Then came the crack, a sharp, splintering sound that tore through the silence, and Louisa vanished, swallowed by the dark water beneath. Elizabeth's heart lurched, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She ran, her boots skidding on the frost, and leapt into the icy depths, the cold clawing at her skin like a living thing. She thrashed through the water, her hands breaking the ice's jagged edges, until she found Louisa's limp form and dragged her to the surface. On the shore, she cradled her daughter, the girl's wet hair plastered to her face, and whispered through trembling lips, "I'll never leave you." The servants rushed from the manor, their shouts a distant hum as Elizabeth carried Louisa back, her soaked clothes heavy and clinging. She was the governess here, a stranger to them, but to her, this child was everything. A daughter lost and found, a secret buried beneath 7 years of silence. How had it come to this moment, this desperate plunge? The answer lay in a deal struck long ago, a bargain that had bound her to this place and this child. It had begun in a darkly lit room, the air thick with shadow and the scent of old wood. Elizabeth stood there, 7 years earlier, her hands clasped tightly, her pulse a quiet drumbeat against the stillness. Across from her, hidden behind a lacquered screen, was Charles, his voice low and deliberate, each question a needle pricking at her resolve. "Are you healthy?" he asked first, as if her worth could be measured in flesh and bone. Then, "Why aren't you married?" A question that stung with the life she'd never had the chance to claim. And finally, "Why would you do such a thing?" His tone heavy with a curiosity she couldn't ignore. "I'd sell everything I had for a living," she answered, her voice steady despite the tremor within. "But you only need me temporarily." The truth hung there, raw and unadorned. He needed her for a moment, she needed him for survival. Her father's debts loomed like a specter, and this was her way out. 3 nights, a child, and payment. The questions unsettled her, not for their sharpness, but for the mirror they held to her desperation. She accepted, driven by necessity, and the first meeting ended in that shadowed silence. Back in the present, the fire crackled in the manor's hearth, casting flickering light across Louisa's face as she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Elizabeth knelt beside her, brushing damp hair from the girl's forehead, her heart a tangle of relief and fear. She'd saved her daughter, but the act had cracked open something deeper, a mother's instinct she'd buried under years of forced detachment. Louisa didn't know the truth, not yet, but Elizabeth felt it in every breath the girl took. But Elizabeth's mind drifted to the days before this one, to her arrival at the estate as governess. She'd come 7 years after the birth, driven by whispers of her daughter's existence. The manor was grand, its isolation a mirror to the hotel where it all began, and Louisa was its wild heart, a lonely, stubborn child who'd expelled 3 governesses before her, who locked herself in the lake pavilion to shut out the world. Their first meeting had been a clash, Louisa's sharp, "Go away," slicing through the air, her eyes narrowing with the arrogance of a girl spoiled by neglect. Elizabeth hadn't flinched. She saw her own fire in the child, a reflection of the woman who'd sold herself to save her father, and she'd stayed, determined to bridge the gulf between them. But Charles had returned the next day, his face blanching at the sight of her. "You shouldn't be here," he'd said, his voice tight with shock he couldn't hide. "You broke the contract." She'd met his gaze, unflinching. "I can't forget her laughter, the sound when she was born. Can you?" His anger flared, accusing her of betrayal, but the governess contract gave her a month, a foothold he couldn't uproot. He'd told her then, his voice bitter, why she'd been chosen. 10 years ago, his wife's accident had left her a shell, and he'd needed an heir to preserve his lineage. "I never thought we'd meet again," he'd said, and she'd seen the man beneath the duke, a prisoner of duty, tethered to a past as heavy as her own. The hotel came back to her now, vivid as the ice she'd broken through. It was a place apart, its walls steeped in solitude, and Charles had waited there, a well-dressed gentleman with a glass trembling in his hand. He'd sipped too often, his small talk stilted, his nerves a quiet undercurrent to his words. "We only have 3 days together," he'd said, his tone clipped, as if stating a fact he wished weren't true. In 10 months, when the baby's born, boy or girl, you'll be paid. But you must keep it secret, never contact the child. She'd nodded, her lips pressed tight, and turned to undress, the rustle of fabric loud in the quiet room. That first night, she'd lain on her side, letting him perform the ritual awkwardly, his touch gentle despite the coldness of their purpose. She'd stared at the wall, counting the seconds, noting his respect, a gentleman's restraint in a stranger's act. The second night, she'd softened, her guard slipping as she felt the warmth of his skin, the intimacy of their closeness. Tears had come afterward, silent and unbidden, a shame at sharing this with a stranger she couldn't name. Charles had noticed, sitting up, his voice soft. "Tell me," he'd said. "Let it out." She hadn't spoken, but the air had shifted, their silence less oppressive. By the third night, she'd met him fully, her desires rising in a passionate farewell to their brief time. It was more than duty, it was a release, a moment of connection she hadn't expected. 10 months later, the birth had come, a girl after a long, grueling labor that left her hollowed out. She'd barely glimpsed the child before it was taken, the pain of that loss sharper than the birth itself. No mother could be indifferent to her child's absence, and Elizabeth had carried that wound ever since. The years between stretched out in her memory, a quiet tapestry of longing. She'd saved her father with the money, but the price was a daughter she'd never held. Every birthday, she'd sat with her sketchbook, pencil trembling as she wrote, "Happy birthday, little one. May you be safe. May you be loved." The words were her only tether, a ritual that kept the ache alive but bearable. 7 years of this, until the news of Louisa reached her. A name, a place, and she'd seized the chance to see her, becoming her governess under a guise Charles wouldn't recognize. Now, beside the fire, she watched Louisa breathe, the past and present colliding in the girl's fragile form. Louisa's defiance had brought them to the ice, a rebellion rooted in years of neglect and a father's indulgence. Elizabeth remembered their first lessons, the girl sneering, "You're poor and uneducated," her voice a whip honed by loneliness. Elizabeth had locked her in the classroom, letting her cry and rage until the fight drained out. Charles had stormed in furious, demanding it stop, but Elizabeth had stood firm. "She's been ignored," she'd said. "She doesn't know herself. This will help her." To prove it, she'd vowed to share every punishment. When Louisa refused dinner, Elizabeth went hungry too. When Louisa cursed her, wishing her dead, Elizabeth bore it, teasing, "Tell me how you'd do it." The exchanges wore the girl down, her resistance softening as curiosity took hold. One day, Elizabeth had laid cards on the table, simple words, grammar, and spun a story. "Fire is magic," she'd said, her voice low and captivating. "It stops time. When it's out, you're free. When it lights again, it's like nothing happened." Louisa had listened wide-eyed, drawn in by the tale. But she'd pushed harder afterward, testing limits, and Elizabeth had met her with a raw truth. "When you marry, you'll lose everything, except your mind. No one can take that." The words struck deep, and Louisa stopped fighting, her studies beginning in earnest. Charles had watched, gratitude softening his gaze, but something else flickered too, a warmth that echoed their 3 nights together. That warmth had grown, Elizabeth realized, as she sat by Louisa's side. She'd watched Charles swim in the lake, his form blurred through glass, her fingers brushing her neck as longing stirred. He'd sat by his wife's bedside, speaking to her still form, but his thoughts had strayed to Elizabeth. One night in the study, their eyes had locked, and he'd recounted their past, seeking distance, but found none. They'd surrendered. A night of passion free from morality's chains, a fire rekindled from ashes long buried. Louisa, sensitive and perceptive, had sensed the shift, her walk on the ice a silent rebellion against the currents around her. As she recovered, she'd opened up, sharing her visits to the sick lady she knew wasn't her mother, her love for the pavilion as a refuge. Winter deepened and Charles's father, Lord Clay, returned, a hedonist who threw a Christmas ball. Charles, no dancer, had spun Elizabeth in private, their bond tightening. But trouble loomed, his business faltered, debts forcing him to sell the estate, a prison tied to his wife's decade of suffering. He'd loved her, but questioned if he'd kept her alive for her or himself. In torment, he'd extinguished the fire, opened the windows, and let the cold claim her, praying for forgiveness. Elizabeth, uninvolved, felt his guilt's shadow. Days after the lake, Louisa found the sketchbook, the birthday wishes spilling the truth. "You're my mother," she'd said, hurt and all warring in her voice. "Why give me away?" Elizabeth's answer was raw. For 500 pounds to save my father. Louisa, too young to grasp it fully, smiled faintly. You made a lot of money. It was forgiveness, simple and pure. They left the manor in a carriage, Charles, Elizabeth, Louisa, casting off their chains for a new life. From the ice's break, the thread had unraveled, back to the shadowed room, forward to redemption. Time heals, Elizabeth thought, but only when you let go, trusting love's sharp edge to cut you free.